Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the Beneath the Transaction podcast. I'm your host, Chris Pineda, and this podcast has changed over time. It used to be the Rooted Leadership podcast. This year, we kind of rebranded it to Beneath the Transaction, named after my book that is available now actually for pre-order. It's coming out in May, and it's based on research that I did for ultimately over the past decade, trying to understand transformation and trying to understand how do we move beneath the transaction and create transformational change in our life and in our leadership. So I'm really setting out to interview and find people that I feel have something to say with that topic and that idea. So today, I want to introduce our guest today, Joslyn Beaver, and Joslyn has a long history in philanthropy. And as you know, philanthropy, I love the world of philanthropy. That's really what funded a lot of my research. I worked for a philanthropist. So I've been on that side of philanthropy, the giving side, so to speak, for many years. And I saw how transactional it can be. And part of our efforts was actually to sort of break through that transaction. So when I saw your background, I feel like, okay, she's probably got something to say with this topic. So currently Senior Vice President or Chief Philanthropy Officer at Benedictine, and you've been there, what is it, almost coming on 2 years, it looks like?
Yep.
Okay, so a lot of experience, and I could list off all the other years and roles you've had, but I'll let you share a little bit more of a snapshot of your background, why you feel like you have something to say around transaction in the world of philanthropy, and then I'll talk about what I feel we can have a really great conversation on today and how I think that's applicable to anybody. So go ahead. I'll turn it to you for now.
Yeah. Well, I think I have most people in this field kind of fell into having one of these roles, but I came to it as a first generation college student. I never knew this was even a field. And I had started my career at the University of Minnesota doing research grants and putting together funds for large scale federal funding. And eventually I was an admin director for a center that had been created for a philanthropic gift. And at that time, the the family that had made the gift to create this center, I had a really close connection with them because the matriarch of the family had the same disease that my mother had passed away from. And so we just had this really nice connection. And his buddy was raising $25 million for his center. And so he decided he was going to raise $26 million for our center. And so we started raising a lot of funds together. And one day kind of pulled me aside and said, I feel like reviewing spreadsheets and budgets isn't your greatest gift. You seem to understand people and strategy, and I think your gift could go towards making the world a better place. And he at the time was the chair of the board at our foundation at the university. And I said, well, yeah, but I'm not qualified for that. And he said, yeah, no one is. You just got to go do it. And so that is how I got into this. And once I started working in fundraising, I kind of started to understand the science behind fundraising and how to do that. And I often talked about how I learned it from the inside out because I was on the side of building out these budgets for these large multi-million-dollar things. And I always understood just how expensive it was and what it took to do the work and could translate that to folks. And so I had a wonderful 22-year career at the University of Minnesota, a lot of the medical side of things and science and engineering, and in my alma mater, the College of Liberal Arts. And eventually, I loved the University of Minnesota. It was wonderful. I learned a lot. I felt a calling to leave the U. And so I went to a large Catholic organization, university in town, learned a lot there. They had a lot of really important, great work happening. Got to lead their corporate and foundation relations there for a few years. Went to our children's hospital, got to do that work. And then now I'm at Benedictine, which is one of the larger senior care organizations in the country. Nonprofit Catholic organizations. So I've really been blessed to get to do a lot of really important work and both create a legacy for folks while making an impact. So it's been a real blessing.
Yeah, it's a great background for one, but I also love how you say you fell into it. And I think a lot of people say that about their careers, but I've seen it more so than others in kind of the world of philanthropy. That really is true. You kind of fall into it. And usually those origin stories is somebody kind of taking a risk on us, right? And complete side note to the conversation, but I think overall we need to take more risks on people. And I don't think there's a coincidence that, people in the world of philanthropy that are around this sort of spirit of generosity a lot are more willing to take risks on people than maybe in other industries because they've maybe seen the power of generosity and influence in very different ways than you would in the corporate world or other spaces, government, maybe kind of traditional education as well. So I think that's a great origin story. And obviously, as you know, very similar to mine. I had no business for a multi-millionaire to take a risk on me as a mid 20-year-old at the time to help him transform our community. That was a pretty big risk, but I'm obviously grateful that he did, and I learned a lot along the way. What I wanted to dive into based on our conversations and what we were just talking about offline that I think is incredibly valuable conversation to have is, we're talking about how do we move beneath the transaction in life and our leadership. One of the things that I believe make it difficult isn't just the nature of going through the motions. I think we're creatures of habit. We go through the motions, we check the boxes, but we have these external pressures that make it really hard. And that can be pressures to perform, to produce, to sort of get things done, which all have a transaction typically connected to them. But the pressures to do those things, the pressures to, perform not just in our place of work, but even in our own relationships to like meet a certain standard or deadlines,
Uh-huh.
that can be incredibly hard to overcome. And I know you have something to say around that because in philanthropy, there's a lot of pressure. And you mentioned it. I mean, a $26 million project, right? And those funds are funds that are personal to people and they want to give them, there's just a lot of pressure all around, and I found philanthropy being so highly highly full of pressure. Before that, I had experience in sales and experience to perform. I was a collegiate athlete, so I get the idea of performance, but there's something about philanthropy where you have this stewardship over an incredible amount of resource and wealth that's not yours, that can create a high level of pressure. So talk us through what those pressures are like and what people you've seen, kind of how we typically handle them, like the natural way of dealing with those things, but then how you found how do we kind of move beneath that and still break out of the transactional nature of it into what I would call sort of the soil of transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really natural, especially for folks that don't maybe understand philanthropy and what that process looks like with working with others to say, hey, go get this. Go get this right now, right? So maybe you're in an organization that's looking at a delta of a few $1,000,000. Say, hey, go talk to these people and go get us some money. And I think that a lot of times those of us in these kinds of roles are people pleasers. We want to be able to say yes. And so people will say, yeah, we can go do that. But I've always kind of had the belief that by saying that and then under delivering, you're not pleasing anyone. So that's kind of been my star to say, I want to have realistic expectations. I want to know how we're going to get there. I don't like to put that on my team to, agree to something that's not realistic. So to really spend a lot of time internally. So that's internally with the board, internally with our leadership, internally, like with those cross-functional folks say, this is what we've got right now, and to be able to kind of walk through that. So I think that that's a big part of it. I kind of think about this work as a three-legged stool, right? So you've got your external work, working with the donors, working with the constituents, like those stakeholders. You've got your internal folks that you're working with, the people that are doing the work. You got to be able to manage those expectations to be realistic. Like, yeah, we could do $10 million, but probably not in the next 3 months. Maybe it's over this period of time, and maybe it's over, whatever the reality is. And then you've got the folks that you're serving. So you really have to manage a lot of different people at the same time. And so I think that's a really important reality. And you just have to be strong, comfortable saying no when you can't deliver. And maybe it's not a no, not ever, but it's not right now. Just because saying yes and then letting them down isn't right either. right? And I think there's just a lot of that pressure that ends up happening. The other thing that could happen, and I've seen it far too often, is maybe somebody says yes, but then they start focusing on all these teeny tiny little things. So then they're going to donors and then they're asking and asking and asking and asking. And they never slow down enough to say thank you
Mm,
and actually show the impact of what they've done. So then that donor feels like an ATM machine.
mm,
I think that that's one of the things that I've really spent a lot of time talking to team members about. Well, have you told them what you've done with their gift? Have you spent time letting them know about the impact? Have you shown them what you've done with that? And I think that when you're in the seat of the fundraiser and making that ask all the time, you have to be reminded sometimes to say, stewardship is one of our values. So how are you living that? How are you showing folks what you've done with their money? How are you showing, because your current donors are always going to be your best next donors. So, how are
I
you
think,
actually living those values? How are you demonstrating that you're worthy? How are you demonstrating that you've done a good job with it so that you can be trusted to invest even more? Because at the end of the day, most folks, they're kind of social impact investors. So, you have to demonstrate good work.
yeah, I think you're highlighting something really important that I want to emphasize because I think this will be people's struggle when thinking about transformation is like, well, transformation is this sort of big, like non-tangible thing. And how do we measure it? It's not possible because I gotta do my job. I gotta go through life and life's full of transaction. But it really comes down to controlling the controllables,
Yeah,
right? Because you
100%.
can't, what I'm not saying in the book and what we're not talking about is like just change your whole life circumstance, and then all of a sudden you'll experience transformation. And that's actually the opposite, right? If we're relying on things outside of ourself to transform us, then we'll never experience it, right? We have to create these things. Now, individually, these conditions are created in things that I can control. In an organization, in a team, they're created through things that we can control, but it's not external. It starts within us, and I think that that's really important. And I hate to use this analogy because a lot of people maybe use the analogy of Disney for things, but one thing I
That
like about
experience. Yeah, I
yeah,
hear.
one thing I like about
Mhm.
Disney is they're really good at controlling things that they control. We just went to Disneyland with the kids in February, so it's recent, and they're so good at creating this experience, this we'll call it transformative moment for families because they control, what they can control. There's one entrance and one exit, into the park. You can't like, you go to Knott's Berry Farms or what have you, there's multiple entrances. You can, and the rides are right there. You can get right to the action. But Disneyland, you gotta there's music playing, you gotta go through this entrance and you you have to walk quite a ways to even get to rides, but it's this experience that you go through in the moment. And those are the sort of systems and conditions and process that we can create. So on our teams, we might have to meet certain deadlines. We might have to produce certain results, but what we do along the way and the little systems and processes that we can create, you mentioned a really simple one, gratitude and saying thank you and not just doing it as a transactional routine thing. Well, let's make a plaque, let's put their name on the plaque and send it to them in the mail. Like, let's make it personal. And I remember, the gentleman that I worked for many years, he hated being recognized for things. He's very behind the curtain, didn't like things named after him. But that's obviously what a lot of people want to do. They want to name things after you. They want to, all these things. But I had multiple very intimate personal conversations with him where all he really wanted was a sincere, thank you. A handwritten note or letter swinging by, scheduling a time to swing by and actually, have that conversation. Like that's what he wanted. So, but again, we can control those things. We don't have to just succumb to the external, maybe the external, we'll say forces or the
Pressures.
norm pressures. We can control what we can control and be intentional about that. And I think that creating conditions for transformation require a high level of intentionality behind things that people mostly just sort of write off as, well, that's just the way things happen and that's how we do it. And I would say to break out a transaction is to resist that and say, well, no, we can be a little bit more intentional here. We can do something different here.
One of my favorite things that I learned along the way, so when I was at the University of St. Thomas, and I think they do this a really, really well, and I've since adopted it in my current organization, they structurally they'd have a format, right? They'd have this template that you would say, all right, Chris, this is everything you've ever done at the organization. Here's the total giving that you've ever done. Here's a couple of, the biggest gift you've ever made. This is your total giving. Here's a couple of testimonials from folks that you've impacted. Short and sweet, 2 pages, couple of pictures, and thank you. Thank you so much. And so we've done the same thing at Benedictine. This is your total giving. This is what you've done. And, you can kind of customize it for that person. But it's a way for us to really show them the impact that they've had at the organization. And it was interesting because, that's what I love about having the role that I have, that I get to actually like deploy our resources and create some of these things. And we had somebody up in small town Minnesota, farmers, former farmers, and be able to show them, look at what you've done in your lifetime. And they were so moved. And the same thing, anonymous donors, they don't want a lot of, pomp and circumstance,
Yeah.
but they also want to know what you're doing with their money. They're smart, they're strategic, they're thoughtful about what you do with their resources. And it's in a small town, they've been working their whole life for every nickel that they've ever had. But the development person that worked with them put that together, showed them everything that they ever have done, got done showing that, and then mentioned, hey, we need a new vehicle for our community. They wrote them the check that day, covered
Yeah.
the entire thing, and made it happen. All at once, the whole thing. And so I just think it's such a powerful tool. It's a tool because it's the right thing to do. Like one of the things we would always talk about at St. Thomas, and it's a, Catholic reality, is you can do well by doing good. It's kind of living your values by actually doing good.
Yeah.
And so it's not rocket science, but it actually takes some intentionality and thoughtfulness and slowing down a little bit to do the right thing, honor people, and treat them right.
Yeah.
When you do that, it's a better experience.
Hmm.
And so I think it's just helping the team see that and then step back and treat people like people.
Yeah. It's such a good point, because you mentioned if you have values, actually live them. And I
Live
was
them every day.
and I was just helping an organization, kind of recast strategic plan and create recreate sort of vision, mission, values, and I've done that a lot with organizations over the years. But those things can typically be, writing on a wall. They can typically be, well, these sound nice, and so if somebody asks, this is what we would say to them. But and this is the sad truth, is I would say most organizations don't live them, and it's because it's a lot easier said than done, and it requires a lot of intention. And sometimes it's not what's the word? You can't feel it. It's not tangible. So to
Tangible.
say, well, we have these 5 values that are important to us. Let's bring those out now when we have to make these decisions, right? And there's things at stake. There's people's, jobs at stake, or there's money at stake, or there's relationships, or whatever it is. Let's actually pull these values out and let's make decisions on these, with these influencing us, or let's create a system or a process that is informed by these values. I don't think organizations do that enough. And frankly, I don't know if we do that enough as people. I think that we say we value certain things, but our actions and sometimes our behaviors don't always align with those things. And that's a challenge, Organizational assessments that we've done over the years, we would find that, well, here's what they espouse as an organization, and here's what they enact. And those things are typically pretty out of alignment, which is a problem, because that means, well, we say we value trust and stewardship. You mentioned stewardship and whatever. We can name all these nice sounding values, but as we would interview people on the ground, frontline to
Right.
even customers or partners, that they were typically out of alignment.
Mhm.
And that creates dissonance in your culture, and that creates challenges. And again, personally, I think we have the same thing. We value something, but then it's not always here.
Mhm.
And it requires intentionality to stay aligned to those things, even in the everyday mundane things that we are supposed to do. As you were talking, I actually thought of a story in the book. See if I can find it really quick. It's in one of our final chapters. Let's see. I think it's chapter, no, no, no. Yeah, it's chapter 10, which is condition number 6, building deep and trusting relationships. Yeah, chapter 10, go deep, not wide, build something that withstands the storm. And I use an example of one of my friends named Brian, and he was so good at being intentional. And I think there's so much to learn from this example of Brian, because he took the normal everyday thing, like people's names that we meet and get to know, and we always, if you're like me, you use the same excuse all the time. "Oh, I'm so bad with names." It's like, no, I just wasn't intentional enough to remember the name,
Remember,
right?
yeah.
I didn't care enough in that moment. He was so good at controlling what he can control, right? You can't control all these external things. You can't control if people like you. You can't control always, the elements of your job or your routines or what you have to do, but you can control remembering somebody's name. So could I read this to you
Yeah,
for
please.
just a second? And I think this will deepen our conversation on intentionality and what you said at the end, right? Like, let's treat and see people as people, right?
Uh,
So this is again, this is the very beginning of chapter 10, go deep, not wide, build something that withstands the storm. So in a world obsessed with expansion, more followers, more contacts, more reach, depth has become a lost art. We build networks instead of relationships, audiences instead of communities, influence instead of trust. But when the storms come, and they always come, it is not the width of our network that holds us, it's the depth and trust of our relationships. Depth withstands, depth heals, depth transforms. My friend Brian is a powerful example of why what deep truly means in a relationship. From the first moment, Brian's presence was disarming to me. His questions weren't the casual kind that most people just ask to be polite. He asked as though the answer really mattered, as though I really mattered. His eye contact was steady but soft, his listening full of space. I remember thinking, no one can actually be this authentic all the time. And I actually thought, this kind of comes off as inauthentic and fake. Like, there's no way that somebody can care this much. Years later, he's exactly the same, right? It's been 10 years, he's exactly the same. Our first long phone conversation revealed the depth of who he was. My intent was to learn about his vision, and because he was a really key part of this journey of transformation. So his vision of transformation in their community. But what I didn't expect was that Brian would spend most of the call asking about me, my story, my hopes, my beliefs. He cultivated a depth of connection that stripped away the transactional tone of our roles. It was as if he built a bridge of trust before either of us realized it. You may know people like this. Conversations with them stand out from all the others. That single call set in motion a relationship that would change the trajectory of my life. So later I ended up working with this philanthropist who he actually connected me to. That's why he was kind of key in this story. So over the years, I've watched Brian live the same way with everyone. In meetings as the CEO of his company, Neighborly Ventures, which is a real estate development construction company. In breakfast as friends or in gatherings with hundreds of employees, he treats every conversation as if it were sacred, as if that person in front of him is the only one that in existence. I once invited him to speak, so this is the really fine nuance of detail of intention that I want to highlight in this story. So I once invited him to speak to a cohort of leaders in our Leadership Institute. He greeted participants by name and referenced small details about their lives. Later, several of them asked me, how did he know those things? How did he know my name? And I was thinking, as he was up there speaking, he's actually calling people by name and then saying things as if he knows about their life and what they do. And I'm like, how does he know these people? He must have, like before we got started, he must have been mingling and spoken with these people. I know how Brian is. Like he learns things about people like that and he'll remember them. So I'm thinking that's what he did. But then all these people are coming up to me saying, how did he know my name? And how did he know my life? Like they were sort of perplexed, like, this is weird. Like, how did he know that? And then I realized that he had simply memorized their bios and faces that we sent him weeks before,
Wow.
something that we did with all of our guest speakers, but none of them actually used this way. He learned their names and details, not for performance or being recognized, but for relationship. That's Brian. He does his homework on people, not to impress them, but because he really wants to see them. Depth is not drama, depth is not discipline, and Brian lives that discipline daily. as a business leader, a board member of a large nonprofit, and a regional religious leader, you would think that the only way he could survive would actually be to treat interactions transactionally, surface deep. That is what many high capacity leaders do because their bandwidth is so limited. But Brian is the exact opposite. I once sat in a meeting with his executive team where I was presenting the results of an organizational assessment, just like the one I told you about, right? And we found huge gaps in his organization's espoused values versus what was actually happening. And to get all this feedback as an executive team was hard for them. They were like, oh my gosh, this is heavy. So we shared the results of an organizational assessment. Some results were not favorable. And instead of becoming defensive, I saw in his eyes a genuine eagerness to learn and make things right for his people. In the same meeting, he said, if we aren't running a company where people are seen and relationships are valued, then I don't want to be the CEO. We might do real estate, but what matters most is that our 100+ employees feel like they actually matter.
That's great.
Again, this is a nice thought and a gesture that I've heard other CEOs say, but few ever follow through on it. But he did. At the next all-company meeting, he publicly apologized to his employees for his leadership failures. That was vulnerable, yes, risky, but because of the authenticity he had shown up with in and day out before that moment. And then I'll kind of summarize, but the irony was in the assessment, everybody actually loved Brian. Their problem wasn't with Brian, it was with mid-level leaders in their organization, but he still was the one that stood up and apologized for his
Fully owned
failures as
it.
a leader. And so he's an example to me of what we're talking about. Now in the book, he's in this chapter on building deep and trusting relationships, but he's an example of being intentional with the things that we can control. And we can always control how we see other people, how we treat them, the little things, remembering their names, the details of their lives. I mean, he saw all these 30 bios and memorized faces enough to show up and be like, that's Jordan. And Jordan's a chiropractor in the community. And it's just, it was incredible. And I just thought he talked to him offline before we started. No, it was bios.
Seems like a really neat guy.
Yeah. So sorry to take all that time, but I wanted to
No,
add
it's
some
great.
depth to what you're highlighting, that we have control over the little things. So now let's tie that into this question I started with was, what do we do when we have pressures in life to perform, to produce? How do we not let that dictate our ability to be genuine and authentic and real?
I mean, I think you just have to. I remember one time early on in my career, I had somebody, maybe not early on, but early on in my leadership career, I'd gotten feedback that, it felt like a lot of my performance, which, I was a high performer, maybe came from a fear of failure versus knowing that you're enough. And I was like, well, then how do I do that? And she was like, it's just something you got to deal with. And it's just kind of being able to settle into your own skin and knowing that you are enough. And I don't know how you do that, but eventually you do. And I think it just takes, making a lot of mistakes and recovering. And you don't get it except for with, making mistakes and surviving, because you always learn through your mistakes. You learn through challenges and you're okay, And I think that the reality is mistakes happen. Challenges happen. You're never going to not have them. And I just think things always work out how they're supposed to. And so that pressure is never going to stop. That need's never going to stop. And it's only going to grow. But if you shrink and get hard as a result, you're not helping anything. If you take it and absorb it and focus and organize and keep the big picture in mind, then you can actually do something useful, right? So like one of the things I think a lot about, and this is what I've done the last few roles I've had, and I attribute a lot of this to what I learned at St. Thomas. One of the things I noticed a lot is that transactional piece, right? Like people know they need things, but they grab onto these small little things, like, oh, we need chairs, or we need, furniture, these little teeny tiny little things. Well, that's not very compelling. That's not very visionary. It's not very, inspiring. But when you take a big step back, slow down and look at the big picture, that's what it is that you're trying to help people understand. Because for those of us in this kind of a role, you're that in the middle. You're working with the external people that are wanting to make a difference and have, create a legacy, and the folks that are doing the work to be that bridge. So you have to spend some time with the folks that are doing the work to understand the big picture. What are the gaps? what are the challenges, what are the overall needs, and spend time with the people that are wanting to make a difference. Because the people that want to make a difference, they have a very specific lived experience and they want to do something their way. It may not be the best way to do it within the organization. You also have some people that are often operators and they're thinking really
Hmm.
linear and small. And they're thinking, well, I already got that part paid for by this part. I've already got that part. This is the delta. Well, that delta might not be a very good case for support. So what you have to do is translate in the middle and just share the big picture
Yeah.
and get up on the balcony and tell this bigger picture story. And so if you can kind of help bring everyone along at the same time, big picture, help everyone understand, you're
Hmm.
able to kind of evolve the culture instead of these small, teeny, tiny, transactional, little, tiny things, because that's not getting you anywhere. What you need to do is help the overall organization grow.
Yeah.
So, for example, in my current organization, we're senior care. We did a great job of telling the story when we needed to, renovate a building. Great job. Great job on that. Specific details on building renovations. That's one thing that we do. But what it really rolls up to is holistic care, right? So that is making a beautiful home. But it also, what falls underneath that holistic care is family resources. For seniors, it's not just about that senior, it's their whole family. You got the whole family going through that. And maybe they run out of resources while they're along the way. Well, you need people to help them get onto Medicaid. You need people to do the programming for the whole family. You need people to do all that kind of stuff. And you need to pay for them. You also need transportation to get them out there
Yeah.
and to their various, appointments and to live and to be entertained and to do all that stuff. All of those things are that holistic care. You don't just stop at the building. Then you think about the reality that wealth is concentrated with just a handful of folks.
Hmm.
So you need to be able to have that opportunity for all people. So you don't just stop at the building. You look at being able to have that opportunity for all people.
Yeah.
Then you look at the fact that, for us, we're a Catholic organization. We get to, live our values. So you need the people to do that kind of stuff and to deliver that. That's more need. And then the reality that, healthcare is horribly challenging to staff. And so you need to be able to do the professional development and to support
Hmm.
those people. So just to kind of take a big step back, create a high level case for support, step up on the balcony, tell that story, and then actually listen to the donors and figure out, well, what is it that you want to have an impact on?
Yeah.
Maybe they did want to give it to support the caregivers. Well, you're pushing something else down their throat
Hmm.
that they don't really care about. Well, let them.
Yeah.
Let them give to something they care about because we need it all. Then you move to being more of a matchmaker instead of a salesperson. And then
Hmm.
you create a more, meaningful giving experience. And one of the things I often tell people is, I've never been successful in securing $1 million gift because I'm so delightful. Nobody really cares that much about me. It's about something that they care about. It's something meaningful that they want to do. And so that's my job to help share the overall needs and be a matchmaker in that process,
Yeah.
not sell them something.
Yeah. And this is a beautiful depiction of the reality for a lot of people in their place of work is everything that you're saying is, I agree with you. I think it's so important to paint this picture, to be intentional, but it's not always tangible and you can't measure it. So you mentioned the word operators, like a lot of organizations, especially in healthcare, they try to hire operators, right? Because they need people that can
They need it.
operate.
Yeah.
They need someone that knows the numbers and can oversee clinical things and blah blah blah. But I saw something when I was in healthcare, for the last couple of years before I kind of stepped away to finish this book. I was on post-acute care I ran a couple different facilities, and it was so eye-opening in a couple ways. One was I saw how healthcare is incredibly transactional. Like it's
Mm,
I saw it similar
just
to yeah, I saw it similar to education, where I worked a lot with school districts and education, and I saw that education can be incredibly transactional and difficult, but it was personal to the people. Like people get into education because it's personal to them. I saw the same thing in healthcare. Most people that get into healthcare, especially your clinical side, it's personal. Like they had some experience or, especially in post-acute care with like a grandparent or whatever. So it's personal, but they enter in a system that's so transactional, highly regulated that consumes the decisions and the behaviors.
absolutely.
And then I saw how important, and this is the sort of double-edged sword of leadership. I saw how important leaders were to the success of an operation not just financially and clinically, but culturally.
Yeah.
But the challenge that I think exists in healthcare, and I can only kind of speak specifically for post-acute care because that's what I was exposed to, is that there's a lot of operators, but not a lot of leaders. And operators aren't doing the things that you're saying to do. They're not stepping up on the balcony, showing the bigger picture. They're not setting tone with culture by formal values and then following up on those things, living them, setting vision. They're not, in the way I would say it in the book, creating these conditions that will outlive them. Because I would see as soon as a leader would leave, immediate difference. I mean, I stepped into a turnaround building that was failing in the red for 2 years, and there's 2 leaders there before me. And the one just before me was a very seasoned healthcare administrator, been doing it for over 10 years. And the building was absolutely falling apart, right? Great with numbers, things like that, financial guy, right? As soon as I came in the building, like overnight difference, simply because I wasn't seeing the finances as the most important thing. Even though that's what the owners told me, like, we got to turn this building around. It wasn't the most important thing to me. Creating culture was, and making sure that people were actually happy when they showed up to work, because I interviewed a bunch of team leaders, staff. People were crying before they walk into the building. People were afraid to ever speak up in meetings, hence our stand-up meetings daily. There was 3 people that were showing up when they're supposed to be 13. And so
Yikes.
I discovered all of these things, and I realized the problem of this facility is not financial. It is cultural. And that was my focus. 30 days, we turned the building around financially. But here's the thing too, this is going back to my point, is it's hard to make those things tangible. It's hard to measure those things.
I think it's really challenging because of the structure that you're working within, right? So like for healthcare specifically, there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of certain things that you have to do in order to just get paid. And so what those leaders are working against are some really rigid structures in order just to exist. And so what is challenging is I agree with you. I think that there are cultural things and like leadership pieces that people that are able to look more ahead are able to see and make a difference on. You have to have the space in order to do that. But when you are squeezed so tight based on some other external forces, you don't have the space to do that. And I think that's part of the challenge just in what we live with based on regulatory elements and just financial challenges based on what's put upon them that doesn't give them the ability to do that. And so they're just hitting that wall, And then I think that when you look at a lot of the different attrition issues with staffing, it's just a real challenge.
Yeah. And there's certainly, these restraints and, things to overcome. And I found that there's a pretty good blueprint, financially and clinically for those things, especially in healthcare. And there was a plethora of resources. We had so many financial resources and clinical resources. And so it really came down to me to like, okay, follow the blueprint for those things. But the cultural side, there wasn't a blueprint and there was no experts in it. There was just a bunch of people that had certain experiences of what worked for them. And a lot of times it was sort of whittled down to pizza parties and themed weeks. And I just realized with my past experience that that's just
Yeah.
that's only a small piece of culture. And so I put all of my energy into focusing on the culture, and those restraints were real. I mean, staffing, we had, agency in the building, over $100,000 a month was agency for our nursing staff.
Yeah.
We had, our census was incredibly low. And I could keep going on overspend and all sorts of things. Turnover was incredibly high. So on paper, it was an incredibly difficult turnaround. And frankly, I was not an expert in any of those things financially or clinically, right? And so I relied on really simple things at a cultural level. And even to my surprise, the turnaround happened quickly. But to your point earlier and what we were talking about was all you can measure are those numbers and percentages, right? So we could see, okay, there was almost a 200% swing in our bottom line, EBITDA percentage increased by this much. And so it becomes a financial story because it's hard to tell the cultural one. You can't
Well, yeah,
touch
you can quantify it. Yeah.
You can't touch it. You can't feel it. You can say, well, turnover decreased by 50%, which it did, but how, right? What did we do? And it was a lot of what you were sharing. Standing on the balcony, sharing the big picture, being transparent, being intentional with how we hold meetings, with how we start meetings, with how we have a conversation with people, with how we have one-on-ones. And so all of these things that are not super glamorous or sexy are the intentional efforts. It's like Brian, taking the bios and memorizing faces and
Yeah.
names and all these things. It requires those moments from the leader first, but then to spread so that it doesn't rely upon that one leader, right? It's now a systematic
It's a
team
system.
approach
One of
instead
the
of just
things
one good leader.
Yeah, I've got a good story to share. So at the height of COVID within Benedictine, we had a ton, and this all predates me, but it's an example to me of culture and living your values. So one of the things that they talked about, and they just had a ton of agency folks coming through. And of course that, obviously it hits your bottom line. But one of the things that they started talking about was the teams being challenged with the agency folks not living the values. And they said, one of the leaders said, "Oh, I know exactly who is and isn't a Benedictine employee. Look at mealtime. When it's time for our meals, our staff are watching the residents, minding their flock, looking out for them. They're ready. They're watching them. The agency folks are on their phone. They're not paying attention. We got to figure out a way to embed our values and the real way that we want our associates to show up to make our residents feel more safe and secure." So what they ended up doing was starting an internal agency so that they could have frontline workers
Mm.
that actually live the values of Benedictine. And so they did. So they started with CNAs and then they got that going and started moving forward on that. And once they got that moving, they were like, okay, well, we maybe need some nurses. They got more nurses. Then the other thing is, when it comes to like directors of nursing or executive directors, that's another area that's always going to have changes. So then they got some float nurses, float directors, float leaders, and they added that. So then they have what they call is the internal float pool, is what they call is
Yeah.
internal agency. And
Yeah.
it's been a huge game changer
Well, yeah, I bet.
financially. But what's more important is, they're, a top 10, we are a top 10 organization in terms of size. It's a huge opportunity in terms of plugging a hole from a staffing perspective, makes a big difference financially. But the people actually live the values. The folks are feeling safe when they're one of our residents, regardless of who's in the building.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a good example of it was all driven by values,
Yeah.
by wanting to have associates that live the values of the organization. That was what drove it.
Yeah.
And it had this incredible benefit financially to the
Yeah.
organization as well. And I think that is just a perfect example
It's an
of
amazing example.
living your values, acting upon it, and then you have some good that comes of it.
A perfect example. I've never seen an organization, and I've worked across lots of different sectors that have not benefited financially or otherwise when they have focused and leaned into their values and their culture. Because the battle will be time and capacity. Well, we have these things going on, so this is where we got to put our efforts. I've just never seen I've seen the opposite. I've seen how we put time and energy into solving some financial problem and then culture suffers because we kind of force it.
Yep.
Versus I've never seen the opposite happen when you put time and energy into culture and values
No.
and it not benefit things financially or otherwise.
Right.
And again, it's so simple, but we don't do it. And it's because there's this sort of risk. Anytime we want to engage, I think, in anything transformational, there's this risk. And it's like that same risk that, boss took on you all those years ago when you got into philanthropy. The same risk the philanthropist took on me is we have to kind of venture out into this no man's land. I even talk about this in the book, this sort of no man's land, and take a risk on the other side. We have to take a risk that this is going to work. And when it's rooted in values and deeper beliefs, it's just 99.9% of the time going to work, especially when we're intentional about it and we are doing it authentically, right? We're not just going through emotion. Like we're not just deploying something that worked for one person, so I'm going to try it. That's like if I'm running another healthcare organization and I hear your strategy and we're like, well, let's do the same thing. But if I don't really believe in it and don't believe in my values, then me just creating some process is just going to be a cumbersome and burdensome, and
Right.
people are not going to buy into it. The reason why it worked for you guys is because It was born out of, we're not living our values the
Right.
best way that we can. Let's find a way to do it, and similar problem we had at our facility was we were in a very remote area too. So it was hard to get staff. Again, we ended up cutting agency by more than 60% in just 3 months. And it wasn't because all these sort of new CNAs and nurses moved to town. What I found was the reason why we weren't hiring people is because nobody wanted to work here. The culture was so terrible that no employees were referring their friends. Nobody wanted to work there. It had a
Yeah.
bad reputation. All of a sudden, culture starts to change. Employees start to talk about it differently. All the nurses and CNAs know each other. So now they're starting to refer each other. So all of a sudden, we're getting more interviews than we were
Right.
before. But even in the interim where we had to get agency, I would make it a point that I would message them, I was a clipboard or whatever it was, and say, hey, look, we want you to come and fill this shift. And I had our staffers start to do the same thing. This is what's important to us. This is our vision. And we had created a vision together as a building, and it was really
That's
simple.
nice.
It was become a place where every person matters and every moment has meaning. And so it's like more than you feeling this shift for us. So we hit our staffing ratios. We want you to live this while you're here.
Uh,
And if you can't, then we don't actually want you here.
Right.
And so we would have that conversation. So when they showed up, they knew what our number one expectation was. Obviously, do your job, and like you have to maintain your license. So do your job clinically, but you're going to be a part of our organization and taking care of our residents for your shift when you're here. This is what we believe. And those little things started to add up and make a difference. But again, I couldn't sit here, and it's not as great of a turnaround story as saying, well, our EBITDA margin increased by 10 percentage points. That gets attention from owners and operators and things of that nature. But honestly, it was the little things like that that started to make the difference. And what I like about your example, it was organizational wide of taking, let's now be more intentional
Right.
systematically to deploy this process that's going to help us live our values and what we stand for in a sustainable manner. So it doesn't rely on one leader that's doing
Right.
one thing that works for them. It's, let's find out what works for our organization. And I think that's why that's a great story.
And I think in both cases, it's about setting expectations. This is what's expected, and then holding people accountable to those expectations, and if things are askew, reining it back in.
Yeah. I like how our conversation has gone with philanthropy. We've gone into more nuance of healthcare and culture. That's what's great about
We've
the
covered a lot of
show.
ground, Chris.
It's what's great about the show, and the reason why I wanted to talk to so many different people is because I found what worked for us. And we did conduct formal research, and we found 7 things that work, but I want to learn from others of what have they seen, and what have they done to help break out of this transaction. So, my final question for you is, based on our whole conversation today, what would be your summary in a 1 or 2 sentences that can help any listener to live and lead a life beneath the transaction? What can they do?
Think I'll just I'll quote my dad, and he used to say, at the end of the day, you got to be able to look yourself in the mirror, and you just gotta be yourself. He goes, I've never had a hard time looking at myself in the mirror. So just do the right thing, And if you are trying to pinch yourself and bend yourself into a pretzel for so many different people, you're not going to really be your authentic self. And if you sit with it and you look at it, there is a path. It's clear. It's always clear. Doing the right thing is really easy. It might not feel easy because you're always going to get a lot of pressure, but you always know what it is. And so I think it's not that hard to go beneath the transaction, to treat people like people, and to do the right thing. And so whenever you're kind of pinched and you're not quite clear, slow down, take a step back, and follow your spirit,
Yeah.
because you know exactly what it is.
I love that. It fits with how we started of transformation is not outside of us, it's within us. And, transformation starts by holding up a mirror, right? And looking in the mirror. And on occasion, when I've worked with different leadership teams, I actually bring a mirror and I say, look, this is where transformation begins. And I hold it up. It begins in this room with all of you. And, if I pass the mirror around, it begins with who's staring back at you. And so I love what your dad told you. If we can live a life where we're happy or proud of the person that we see in the mirror, then we're on the right track. And that's measurement every day to live. Can I end my day looking in the mirror happy with who I was and who I became that day for that day, right? And do the same thing the next day and the next day and the next day. I think that's an amazing piece of advice. So There it is for any of our listeners, to summarize all of this is it starts with the mirror and it ends with the mirror. So that's all that we can control when it comes down to it. As an individual, that's all we can control is us and how we respond as an individual to our environment, to other people, to circumstances. We get to choose that. So I think it's a beautiful, beautiful answer to that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us. I think there's plenty to pull from this from any listener, no matter if you work in philanthropy, healthcare, or, you're a stay-at-home parent or whatever. It doesn't matter. I think that there's so much that you can pull from some of these ideas that we've talked about, and it's just scratching the surface. So thank you so much, Joslyn.
Thanks, Chris. God bless.
All right, everyone. Until next time, be safe.